Well, it's with great pleasure that I am before you to moderate this round table to talk about relocalization. It's a subject which is gripping. We've been talking about it for some time now. We're aware of the expectations of society towards short circuit, closed circuit, doing things more locally. 66% of France would be happier to buy made in France products and pay a little bit more. And this is a subject which emerged or came to light in the industrial world as well with COVID. And this idea of reindustrialization came to light when we realized just how fragile our globalized system was, and the supply chain was suffering. In the agricultural world, we talked a great deal about food sovereignty. This is one of the main themes of the economic boosting plan of the government after COVID. And we talked about food sovereignty. This is the mother of all battles. We're not really in food sovereignty, but we are a sector which has felt the impact of relocation, of relocation of production. So what do we mean by this subject? Do we want it? Is it desirable? And if so, why? What does a company do if they want to relocate? What difficulties are they encountered? And what solutions can we bring to them? So today we're going to ask these questions. We will hear the perspective from players within the MAP network and in the MAP sector, and people from the political world as well. So we're going to have half an hour of presentations, and then we will have a question time where we'll be happy to share. We'd love you to share your experience as well. So, Pierre CHICOTEAU, I'd like to ask you now, you nearly 20 years ago, you founded Norfeed, which is a plant-based additive company and working on animal food. Now, we're in the aromatic plant sector. You are in charge of production and for purchasing and for R&D, for quality and general administration. Your company has 40 employees and actually manufactures everything here in France, in your factory here in Cnpmai. 60% of the plants that you use are French and 80% come from the EU. So what is your point of view with regards to relocation or coming back to being local? Well, Agnès said it to you. Our company is quite young. It's only 20 years old. So this idea of relocalization, coming back to what's local, is important. Being local is important for all of us. We are in Cnpmai for production and in Angers for the labs and for the offices. We're a small company, but we export a great deal. 80% of our activity is exported, 80% of our turnover. So for us, it's important to have roots, and that's extremely important. We're happy to be in the Angers region. We're very, very happy to be here, and we're far from having roots, though. It's useful for marketing and to show our local skills and our local skill set. So why have we got this approach? We're a local company rooted here, but we're trying to have a greater reach. And this is pretty much like CSR, something that's extremely important for our company. Our corporate and social responsibility has been in place for several years now. We look at the BICOR standard. We've sent in our questionnaires. We've waited to be audited. There's 1 year waiting time to be audited. And this approach of using local resources where the distances between factories and your production areas is extremely important for us all. It gives a sort of sense of importance to what we do. We're looking at CSR. This is always at the forefront of our business policy. It's a commitment to say that we are going to source our products in France whenever possible, and when not, perhaps in the EU then. And so today, the CSR approaches go very quickly. We ask a great deal of people, and particularly in big companies. there's expectations in this. There are expectations in this field. We're working in animal food, and this has specificities. It's a heavy industry, and by that, a large market with quite low costs. But when the year has been very difficult for animal food this year in France. But we were asked for this industry in France and in Europe and elsewhere. We've been asked to have products which are natural, which can be standardized, that can be documented, and products that can be competitive. So we know how to move towards added value of byproducts. We have extracts from grapes and lemons, etc. These are added value products, and we use hectares a second time. And the fact that we can use byproducts is extremely important for us. It gives us an edge. In terms of localization, then, there's something important to bear in mind, that here in the region, we've got a great deal of culture, of crops, and we've got a great deal of extraction equipment. There's everything that we need, this research. We've been looking around CHIETERA. We've been with CHIETERA since the creation of the company. We've been working on lemon balm. We've been talking about a particular variety of lemon balm, which grows here in Anjou. It's not really our biggest product, but it's important, and I think it's an exemplary example of what we're talking about. And we work with the laboratory SONAS, with whom we created an outcome. So being local is important for us. What can I say? Overall, I have quite a globalized world, if you like. We export abroad. And I think what we need to say is we need to do in France what we know how to do in France. When I started this company, I was looking for an antioxidant, a biological antioxidant for animals, and I had the choice between grape and green tea. I'm French, and I'm the grandson of a wine manufacturer, a winemaker, so we know how to use grapes in France, for goodness sake. But we're not going to do green tea. Let's do in France what we know how to do in France, so let's stick to the grape. And then the last subject that I want to touch on. And there's something that annoys me quite regularly, that in animal feed, there's a real confusion between natural products and analogous natural products, which are a real risk when you hear industrialists talking about synthetic essential oils. I think we need to be very transparent on this subject. We can do it, we're the right to do it, and there's certain terms that you can't use. And there, I think there's a risk for the whole branch when we miscall products. Thank you, Pierre. Thank you very much for this point of view. We're going to remain within the same field, and I'll ask Edith Giffard. You're a co-risk manager of Giffard, which makes liquor wine, founded by your ancestor in the 19th century. And 5 generations later, you have 85 employees. You're vice president of the French Federation of Spirit Wines, and you help companies who want to export their products. You produce all of your products in this region, and you export to 70 companies. Can you talk about your point of view with regards to localization? Okay. If I come back to the beginning, my great-grandfather was a pharmacist. There were no labs at that time, so he worked on his own products, like most people did. They created their own elixirs and concoctions, and he worked particularly on mint and the digestive virtues of mint. He picked some peppermint, the Mitcham variety. That was his favorite, and this was found for the first time in Mitcham, which is in south of London, I believe. It's one particular variety of peppermint, which is full of spicata and aquatica, and at the time, we had his journal, actually. We had his diary. He used to write everything down. And this, for people involved in herbal medicine, these were very well reputed. The people liked them for their fine and strong taste and their digestive virtues. They were also particularly refreshing. I think through the menthol content. So he produced, he made it come in the form of essential oil from mitcham, and instead of creating a medicine, he created a liquor. And in 1885, he wrote in his journal, pardon me, I'm going to change professions. I'm going to turn my pharmacy into a little distillery, and the future will tell me if I'm right to do it. And all these years later, here we are following Grandpa's recipe, using the mitcham plant, which gives its specificity to the product. With regards to this relocation or relocalization, what interested us was in 2007, we have, obviously, our fifth generation is in the wings. They're waiting. It's a very long-standing family company. And Cnpmai, this is one of the key regions, maybe even in the world, for aromatic plants, for maps. And we said to ourselves then, and we said amongst each other, how about if we started planting this mitcham plant in Anjou? It was a kind of nod to the past, who went to get his plant in England. But how about if we could now plant it here? If we could get back to local sourcing and make this a local product? How would that do? So our job is to produce liquors. It's not to grow plants. So from the beginning, we worked with the Cnpmai, with Mr. Bouvrat-Bernier. I'm not sure if he's here. I know he's retired, but we worked with him. He liked this project. We purchased mitcham plants. We had to find this, and we had to find this in a conservatory in the middle of the forest. And in 2008, and the Cnpmai began then to plant this in their sector. We had 2 years of crop rotation to have enough essential oils to see if we had enough to see if, and then to test and see if it worked. After a certain number of small harvests, because we wanted to ensure that it worked well, we began to have a real harvest, working with territories. And François Duvaux, I don't know if he's here, and we found farmers who were able and willing to plant the mitcham plants for us. And of course, they had been multiplied under a greenhouse effect in the region. And they planted them, and then the first harvest was done in 2013. And this allowed us to incorporate a part of local essential oil in our pasty mint. Where was this mitcham produced initially? Well, at some point it was in south of France, and then there was no more in France. Mitcham reacts quite well to all continental climates. You can find it in the United States, you can find it in India. But what we want is to have a real link with the producers. We know the producers, we know the radius in which this is produced, and that's where we buy. And now we buy a part here. We will never be able to manufacture 100% ici because it is a sterile plant. If ever there was a catastrophe, we have to be sure that we can secure our supply. So we have to make sure that this mitcham plant is also purchased elsewhere as well. We have to have stocks coming from different geographical areas on the planet in order to ensure the safety of our supply chain.
So yes, it's about bringing back the sourcing to something more local. Yes, here we have all the necessary knowledge to make this production. So it was, a kind of emotional decision to take it back here. Now we're going to look at the medicinal plant sector. Jean Maison, you are chairman and founder of the Comptoir de l'Herboristerie. This is based in Corrèze, in the south of France, in a rural area. It's one of the oldest herbology company in France, and its specificity, it's 100% organic, and it's been so ever since it was created in 1970. you don't really export your production much, although you have some international customers. You purchase 50% of your plants in France, and you are invested in various professional structures. You created the organic interprofessional syndicate in Aquitaine. You are a co-founder and member of the professional wild plant collectors in France, and you're an activist for the recreation of the herbology diploma and qualification in France. Well, I'm not the oldest organic herbology producer in France, and one of the oldest. So, first of all, I think there is something about offshoring which comes from different motivations. I think our customers are asking us traceability, responsiveness, direct connection between the raw material and the person processing it or consuming it. That's a real demand. And we also have more commercial issues because the product needs to be marketable. And in the current context, preserving raw material with all its the same advantages as local sourcing is not always easy, especially given the economic imperatives. Thirdly, what's interesting in where you locate your sourcing is the notion of terroir. So what we're passionate about is the personal connection with producers, with their perspectives, but also the nature of the land they work on. As far as I'm concerned, I live in my family region. I left Paris in '76. I wanted to live in this family land. And Saint-Augustin, the town where we're based, is where the headquarters are, but we work all around France and elsewhere. We are aware that being local for the sake of being local doesn't mean anything. It's not about saying I work locally. There are different scales. For instance, if you take collectors within the Collectors Association in France that sell their material directly, they have a direct connection to the consumer. This connection, this contact, happens in a short field, if you will, and the volumes are in consistence with this direct link. Now, if you're talking about companies that need high volumes, it's the different agronomy level. So we have 100% organic and certified collection sourcing, but in terms of agronomy, we need to be able to be profitable, to have the appropriate yields, to enable producers to make a living, and to make sure that we have production systems that provide us with the yields we need without decreasing the quality of the material, because what we work towards is to have someone drinking their herbal tea to be sharing it with the same joy as someone who would be sharing a bottle of wine with their friends. This beverage should have qualities, aromas, a feeling, and everything keeps changing. That's why we need to really diversify our sourcing, but without going overboard with it. But still, we have to really be careful, in theory at least, to make sure that the raw material meets the consumer's expectation or the industrial processing company's expectation. In theory, because in real life it can be a bit different. At the local level, today we're looking a lot at transportation costs, energy costs. Still, Today, we are producing our small doses locally. Even with transportation costs, the Italian ones would be cheaper. So it's a choice, an ethic choice, to integrate some jobs and business activities to outsourcers locally, but it has economic consequences. That means that the consumer's response has to be there. They have to be ready to say, yes, I'm going to buy this product for such and such reason. Maybe we don't communicate well enough about it, actually. That's something to be thought about. In the outlook we heard before, and it was very interesting, I'd like to say that I was really pleased to listen to all the presentations. It was all very well organized, and it's always nice to meet with old friends in the trade. But we can see that medicinal plants says more than it used to say. It is a commercial product, of course, but it's also something that speaks to people's heart. Through this relationship that a plant has to its soil, its nature, its identity, a plant will speak to something more refined, more unique. And that's what we have to offer our consumers. And we need to work hand in hand with all producers, because producing locally doesn't always mean producing great quality products, because sometimes there can be mishaps. So it's our job altogether, given the way we invest, the way we work, the way we communicate and exchange, it's our job to reach the utmost results so that people drinking our teas, our herbal teas, really feel that they are part of this world that puts them in contact with something true and alive. Thank you, Jean, for this testimony. So we've heard the point of view of French SMEs. Now let's listen to two large groups of medicinal plants and perfume plants. So Alexandre Panel, you are in charge of the agricultural and sustainable group for the green vision of Pierre Fabre, which works in pharmaceuticals and dermal cosmetics with 9,600 collaborators. The specificities of this group is to have a capital that's mainly owned by a foundation of public interest. You work in the south of West, you have a lot of hectares producing plants. 20% of what you use is produced in France, and 95% of your products is made in France. So what is your point of view in terms of bringing back outsourcing to more local areas? Well, with Pierre Fabre company, 95% of the end product manufacturing, whether food supplies or pharmaceuticals, is made in France, and we are already remanufacturing France. Still, there are some interesting projects that are still going on. This year, for example, we industrialized manufacturing of one pharmaceutical chemical. So we need to be very close to our territorial aspects, especially the south of France. It is translated through our purchasing policy, because if we look at all the policies that we're doing, all the packaging, all the raw materials that we're buying, we have 70% of our purchases that are realized in France, that are made in France. And if you analyze more accurately what we have there, what do we have in terms of plant raw material? Well, given all statuses of products put together, we have 230 types of plants. It is key for the company, because the turnover of the company of end products that have active substances from plants amount to 40% of our turnover. Still, we have diversified the origin of our plants, because depending on the statuses of our products, what we want is active substances in the raw material. So if you look at these 230 plants that we use in our products, about 20 are from French origin, and the 80% are imported. So in terms of bringing back sourcing more locally, how do we try to do that? Because yes, it is a means to preserve local land in our value chain, especially for raw material supply. One of the solutions is what you said. We need to have 180 hectares of organic cultures in agroecological systems in our region. So the company purchased this in time. Out of these 180 hectares, about 50 of them are dedicated to the production of maps, internal production, and the rest are large crops. So large crops means we are open to testing new productions. With the agricultural sector, we know that it's a very dynamic sector that tests a lot of things. So we used to do linden. It disappeared from France for a while, and it was reintroduced. And now we reintroduced chia seeds or chia seeds. And we also have hemp production for textile or other uses. So we are structuring the sector thanks to our large crop production. But looking at maps specifically to cover our needs, we have 50 hectares cultivated, and we dedicate some of these hectares for trials on about 20 species that are typical of France, and we hope to actually develop new products from these local sources. Saying that, we also work on innovation and new technologies. How are we trying to diversify our 60-year-old portfolio? We have a lot of products. How about working in France on modernization? A few examples. In the years 2010-12, with Helichrysum italicum, we launched products in aromatherapy with essential oils from Helichrysum. In 2012, I think you were faced with this tension on the market, the scarcity of the supply. So end users were having disruptions in the supply chain. So how could we adapt this culture to our pedoclimatic situations to have partial insourcing of this plant? So we have some success stories in local sourcing, about 15 hectares on our lands or in rented lands in the region. What is product locally is organic and local, whether it's rented or owned land. Regarding Helichrysum, what is the percentage of your supply that is French? 20% of our needs are covered by our French production. So this is the percentage that we've managed to reach to remain competitive. So you won't go beyond to secure your supply? Or, well, these 20% enables us to have some lever to have a more secure supply. But of course, we can't be 100% independent, and we have to rely on other productions as well. Another example that I can share is regarding a branch that we have created a few years back. At first, it was a production that required 600 hectares of culture, part in France, part in Eastern Europe. Working with our producer on its working methods, we started thinking, can this conventional production become organic using agroecological systems? And throughout the development of the product, we managed to find agreements. Firstly, bringing back to France these 600 hectares all in France. And so it enabled us to support the farmer in agroecological practices and to have this recognized. So it is a lever certification can be lever to enable the promotion of best practices and local sources and organic production. We talked yesterday about contaminants. We are also thinking, we had trials earlier this year. We tried to acclimate an Indian plant in France. We did those trials. It's a supply that we want to be organic. The product is not yet marketed, so it's one lever. And for more local sourcing, there are also all the notions of regulation and health issues and phytosanitary residues. I don't know if you all know about this. Last year, we had major issues on ETO for plant supply from India. And that organic plant that we were purchasing there was hit. So it meant that we lost some organic certification labels could not certify Indian productions for such plants. So bringing back the outsourcing in France can compensate part of it. Of course, some of our production will remain in India, but it will keep some balance and bring in some secured sourcing. So these are some of the levers that we can use on a case-by-case basis. As Jean Maison said, the point behind all this is also to bring this information down to the end consumer and promoting French production origin, French origin of production, especially in cosmetics or food supplements. We have a brand that is strongly committed, the label France Guarantee. It doesn't certify the geographical origin of the plants per se. So we are currently working on something more about environmental and social labeling of our end products, in which we want to integrate the information for end consumers on the geographical origin of our raw material, plant raw material, especially for cosmetics, where the plant becomes a strong lever of communication. So it's an information we need to pass on to consumers. Well, thank you very much for all this information. We've heard stakeholders from the medicinal and aromatic plants. How about perfume? The perfume industry. So, CHIETERA, you're a manager of department of IFF, which leads in perfume manufacturing. So the Cnpmai labs are specialized in natural. So you produce natural extracts, especially abroad, but also in France. So 4 of your supply branches are set in France for 120 botanical species. And you were telling me that you would like to have some of your products brought back to France. Good afternoon. Thank you for the for inviting me in this roundtable. It is very important to us to be able to testify on the difficulties, but also on our objectives in terms of bringing back the production more locally. As Agnès said, we work on the IFF natural extracts. We are the main in-house supplier for natural extracts, and we also have other clients. So we don't have our own brands. We are suppliers for essential oils and other plant extracts for manufacturers. We do work with over 120 botanical species on our entire catalog. And of course, when thinking of bringing back production more locally, it would not make sense to try and produce everything locally. It would not make sense. But there are many plant species, either in food aromatics, that were offshored in the 20th century, and we've lost a lot of know-how, a lot of genetic resources, variability, and viability of the supply. So bringing back this supply sometimes is faced with hurdles that cannot be overcome. But we can, for some important strains, work on it. Another major issue that we're faced with to work with species that are so different is that the part of the plant that we need can differ. It can be aerial parts, flowers, roots, depending on the extract we're trying to produce. So it would be impossible to bring back to France flower productions, given the very high cost of labor in France. So we are focusing on our R&D trials. We tried to bring back cultures that were very well settled in France before, and that are not anymore for many reasons. And also, it's about cultures on which mechanization is possible, because mechanization is the only advantage that can make France competitive compared with what we have offshore. Because usually abroad it's very manual-based labor, especially for weeding. So the sectors that require direct extraction of the plant after harvesting cannot be brought back to France if they need specific climate that doesn't happen in France, for instance. But we can also work on reducing transportation costs, because if yields for essential oils and extracts, we have yields that are so low, it would require the transportation of very large volumes of raw material before extraction. So sometimes we have essential oils that's 0.1% of the original harvest. So there are some plants which we try to bring back, and in terms of R&D on these plants, the R&D is based in France. This is one of the reasons why French production is a good idea. To have quality follow-up, to have follow-up of the production system and trials on the production system. Even if some of our foreign branches are strongly integrated, we cannot always work the way we wished. So our clients, in terms of marketing, want to have French product on their label, but it's also in terms of quality control and authenticity of some plant variety that we really would like to make sure that some of our branches can be brought back in France while remaining competitive for essential oils and natural extracts. However, it is sometimes difficult to find farmers and collaborators that are okay to work in R&D setups. Because the implementation of a French sector means bringing back the know-how, bringing back the genetic sources, so it takes years of work. As extractor and suppliers, middle people, we cannot guarantee the whole process. So our efforts have really been focusing on the identification of farming partners. And of course, if there is final clients and clients that are ready to pay for it, we can create the sector for certain identified species. Thank you, Giorgiana, for your testimony. So we've heard some economic stakeholders. Now let's hear about the representative from the more political sector. Joël LABBE has health issues and is excused and is represented by Fanny Dupéret, his collaborator at the Parliament. Thank you for accepting to replace him. So Joël LABBE is senator for the Morbihan. He's in the Ecology, Solidarity and Territory group. He's in charge of the working group on herbal medicinal plants. He's committed to the recognition of herbology qualifications and diplomas in France, and he's got a very strong approach presenting herbalism and as a modern trade. So what is your vision?
Well, excuses again. He sends his excuses. He would have very much liked to have been here, but he couldn't come because he has some health issues at the moment. So I'm going to try and represent his point of view as best possible. A point of view that is reflected in his commitment as an activist and in his senatorial position. For us, it's a great satisfaction to see the subject of this roundtable. He's always looking at medicinal plants to see the role and the concern he has with having local sources in the sector. During the information mission, the senators who were members of the working group were quite surprised by the figures he gave, estimating that 80% of medicinal plants of MAPS that were consumed in France were imported. That really called the elected officials to attention. And they realized that this was enormous and that the MAP sector was an interesting sector for the French, for the country, because this is a country which has a long background in production, and it'd be interesting to develop that more. This is a sector where many people were employed, on small surfaces, smaller surfaces than other branches in agriculture. Ecosystemic services were present. And when you look at agricultural, organic agriculture, we can see that it's even better. There's a real demand from citizens. We've already heard it today. There's a bottleneck for MAPS is linked to this research for naturalness and for the products to be local. And of all the questions that surround this, with the terms and with regards the advantages of being sourced locally, the advantages for the environment, and also for the question today of resilience of our economy, of sovereignty. So it's a very important word, this local sourcing. There was also another question, and that was the question of preserving biodiversity, which is extremely important. There's an important part of MAPS which are quite wild, and for some plants there are problems and issues looking to threats to the resource, some locally, some globally. Plants which can see their environmental space disappearing, and other plants which are just not being picked. It's an issue which is more and more a topic in citizen science. And I've highlighted the risk related to the quality of the product. There is the risk of counterfeit products for some plants when there's any kind of delay in the supply chain, resource level. So all of these events made sure that the information fact-finding mission wanted to go further, look at local sourcing, and also raise the question of the quality of products, especially the less you have middlemen, the better the situation will be, having traceability and quality, even if we can also develop that through partnerships abroad. That's the spirit of the fact-finding mission, anyway, to offer support to the development for local sourcing, for local production, having a production which is of a certain quality, having 50% of organic production for MAPS by 2025. when we look at the challenges in front of us, when clients buy products, customers buy products, they expect a certain degree of naturalness in their plants and to make sure that we've respected the environment. And so when you come back to local sourcing, you have sustainable practices in terms of picking the plants. We have many people here to do that. We have also plants which are threatened at resource level, so we need to pay attention to that. And also, when you come back to sourcing locally, you can see that for maps, we were really dealing with the cultural heritage linked to local plants, especially in the pharmacopoeia, the European pharmacopoeia. This could also be a lever to advocate local sourcing for some plants, for exotic plants, for example, which are threatened, to see if perhaps in our traditions were there any alternatives possible to these plants which we could develop, and they in turn would to respond to the desire of the population to acquire and to cement knowledge in France. Another important point is the closed circuit, short circuits. We've already talked about this. Is a certain complementarity to have between long circuits and short circuits. On a smaller scale, they have their role to play. So this vision means what? There's need for political support. Everybody has to be committed to it, but we must have political support in order to get local companies on side to help them through their period of transition, particularly through this energy crisis. Help them by investing in sobriety, renewables, and offer support for relocalization, to coin a phrase, and of course being transparent for the consumer. So companies that put in virtuous practices be well known by the consumer through this transparency. This allows us also to highlight the value of best practice and allows the consumer to make an enlightened choice. In the laws that have been voted recently at European level, we're concentrating on this. There has to be an environmental wing that's extremely clear for everybody, for the consumer, which highlights good and bad business practice. Well, thank you for that. We're out of time. Maybe we won't ask any questions. Oh, we are going to ask some questions, apparently. Thank you to you all. Are there any questions? This would be the time now if you have any questions. Thank you very much for these presentations, these speeches. But I have a question for Alexandre or Giorgiana. You talked about the difficulties linked to recruiting producers. So my question was simple. What do you do? What do you do to try and recruit and to train producers in areas where maps are not traditionally grown? Well, the difficulty that we have is linked to the fact that we don't have any land. And that's the case of many companies who have tried to actually go and buy some tools, production tools. We've carried out small tasks in R&D in terms of varietal selection, using institutes or research centres to help us. And this also means we have to take advantage of our member network in order to promote our approach in the hope that there is someone out there who'll be interested by it. An approach which is supported economically by our company, so there's no real risk of loss for the producer or the potential producer if something goes wrong. Nevertheless, there is a difficulty for producers when they try to project themselves working with species with which they are unfamiliar, because there is still a real trend. There's this real trend of comparing yourself with, what's happening in the world. What's the cost of growing lavender or fine lavender in land which is not very fertile, which is, poorly irrigated, etc. So there is this active participation in enthusiasm to put something in place that might work, but also there's a fear of having to embrace all the possible areas of improvement. And for also you want to try and be competitive in the market. What I'd like to say is that in order to encourage farmers or producers to get on board or to join a partnership with this kind of development, what would I say? Well, I would say there are very few examples, very few success stories. So you'll be a real pioneer in this approach, and that's something that could lend great value to the first stages of getting the product to market. And I think with the help of public financing bodies, there's a commitment from the company, so there's actually no real risk for producers at the rollout of such a product. So this is me launching a sort of public appeal. Please don't be afraid. Well, in order to share an experiment that I did, when it comes from essential oils, we had an experiment over 6 years, an experimental production in our own property with a production method which was very specific, which was not adopted. It was a very clay-based soil. We adapted it. We didn't think it was particularly transferable to other producers, but we depended on the reserves that we had. We couldn't choose the plots. We had to use the ones we had, and we looked for producers to increase our surface. We went to the Chamber of Agriculture, and there was already a real dynamic for some producers to change their activity, to diversify, to go towards maps. So for 2 or 3 years, we welcomed different producers to the area. They came to be trained. They were discovering the constraints and the specificities of maps. We talked about visits in the field. We talked about the different kind of material we use. We shared all kinds of specificities in terms of work time for this kind of production. And that is how we were able to ensure we had some contracts with some producers. And for that production, we committed to 5 years, and we committed to buying all the produce with a guaranteed price in order to reassure them, I suppose, on the long-term commitment that we had to this type of production. Is there a question? Maybe we just take one more question, Sophie? We are 5 generations of farmers. We produce flowers for the perfume industry, jasmine, rose, etc. Flowers that people keep telling us we can't produce in France. We've been doing it for years. We resisted relocation when other people were doing it, and we became industrials almost, because rather than destroying our plants, we bought a factory so we could continue to process our flowers, and that's why we're still producers today. And I would say that it's still possible to do that in France. We can have perfume flowers produced in Grasse today. And I think in spite of climate change, we can still envisage producing our flowers even more so in France. I would encourage you to do it. Look at flowers which seem exotic, but they're flowers that have always been produced in France. We have kept our know-how, and we've managed to risk to project relocation. That was the first thing. And now we're looking at acclimatisation, and by that we begin to produce plants which we source in other countries in the southern hemisphere. The tea tree, for example, which we're beginning to plant in France, and it's working well. There are others. I would encourage you to go forward like this. Opportunities are there in climate change to bring plants to France that we did not produce hitherto. Let's continue to produce in France. Even if it's more expensive for industrialists, they must get used to paying more. Often they've not paid enough. They've relocated, let's face it, to lower their costs. Now, we are the living proof that we can produce expensive flowers, and we have clients that purchase them. And we've resisted. We've resisted in land. We've resisted in many ways. Thank you, and good luck to everybody. Just a comment, if you will, on the purchasing side. If there are some, then we can produce. If not, we can't. Even if 15–20% we've decided is too expensive for some varieties. I'm not talking about the over 120 species with which we work. For some species, it's complicated. I'm sorry, question is off mic. Well, to come back on what you said, when you what species are you looking for? EFF and IFF, sorry. We're not looking for them. We already have them, but currently they are grown abroad. But which ones would you like to bring back to France? You talked about 4 species. No. We've got 4 different platforms where with essentially French products. They've always been kind of French problems, and they will still remain French products or French plants. The ones that we're looking at bringing back are plants which will allow a certain amount of differentiations, and by that I mean the contribution of being cultivated elsewhere. They can express different typologies, different molecules, and I can't say much more on that. We could talk about it again later, but these are plants which are plastic plants, and they might add value if they were produced in France. They have a certain plasticity and might be interested. They might be of interest to a client who wanted exclusive access to such growth. You can conclude. Yes, go on. Well, I'll give a brief conclusion. We will retain the main ideas from these exchanges. The definition of local, what does that mean? Local sourcing. It could mean planting something as close to the place where it's going to be processed. For some, it could mean make sure that each plant grows in its original area. So, you could have a badian field in Vietnam, for example. And Jean, you talked about herbalism and a world library. I think all of that could be applied to all the maps. But really the driver behind companies in location, we've been talking about quality management, we've talked about traceability. These are the drivers that in the context of today, this is extremely important. There's no rupture, there's no hole in the supply chain. And this is really responding to the expectations of the consumer, where they want more local produce and less carbon footprint, a lower carbon footprint. And I think these are all important factors. So finally, it's not always necessary to diversify supply, but it's a way of ensuring the supply chain for all the companies that use these plants. And in terms of difficulties, obviously there's the price, the cost of agricultural manpower. I think it's more expensive here than elsewhere. Also, add to that the cost of energy, the burning question about the purchasing price for the producers, which guarantee a salary, a correct salary for these producers. This is all a question for the commitment of partners upstream. Are they ready to commit financially and humanly in the production of these plants, or in projects where you really have to work hand in hand with the entire chain in the sector? And finally, there is the technical issue when we talk about mastering new cultures, finding a propitious ground or land that lends itself very nicely to developing the plant material, which is not facilitated by the Nagoya Protocol, and mechanizing, but still managing your costs. Now, that goes for all producers of maps. These are challenges for us all. Thank you all for your attention, and thanks to all the speakers, and thank you very much.